It's like every championship team has some lucky breaks with injury. I mean, we had really good ones, like with all the point guards and everything. And what LeBron did was absolutely amazing.
Oh, I've never seen anyone play like that.
But, I don't think I have either.
But Omar, I just want to let you know that we are now live, so that people can be watching.
Hello.
Can be watching this. So this will also end up on YouTube as a stored video. But so my name's Jeff Orton. I'm the founder of Writer's Bloc, and we're going to try something a bit different this month for Bloc Club, which is our online book club. We're actually going to have a chat with Omar Musa, who is the writer of this book here, Here Come the Dogs. And yeah, and if you want to ask any questions, just jump on Twitter and use the hashtag Bloc Club, so BLOCCLUB, or actually through Google Hangouts, you can ask questions directly as well. But I thought I'd introduce Omar as well. He's a Malaysian-Australian rapper and poet from Queanbeyan. He's also the writer of Here Come the Dogs, which we're going to be talking about today. And if you have a look at his bio on his Penguin website, it's really some extensive stuff on there. But you know, you've had a big year.
Yeah, it's been really crazy. I think last year was probably more intense. When the book actually came out, it was pretty stressful because there was not much time between finishing the thing and then actually getting it out there. So I think it was only a turnaround of about a month, like from the final manuscript, handing it into Penguin with all the line edits and whatnot, and then having the thing in stores, which was really gratifying because I drove myself pretty crazy writing this book. I think you can sense it. There's a certain urgency in the book and a bit of a wildness. I think a lot of my writing since then has been a bit more low-key, a bit more structured and well thought out. I mean, that had structure too, but I sort of just wanted my imagination to run completely wild and run riot with that book.
So is that common though, to have such a quick turnaround? Because I read somewhere that you were writing it for over 2 years, and then to go from that to then having it out in a month. Is that common?
I've heard that it is. It just depends on who the author is, I think. And I work well with deadlines. You know, it did drive me a bit nuts, and I felt the pressure a lot. And I felt as if there was a bit of hype around it too. You know, it kind of got named on a couple of lists, like these most anticipated book lists, when I'd only written about a quarter of it or half of it or something. And so that was an added pressure. But then there are people out there who really just take that, take 10 years, 12 years writing a book. And I could never do that. I like to be quite spontaneous, or as spontaneous as I can be, and to get a project out almost every year.
You just used the word hype, and it just made me think of hip hop actually. Like, is there a publishing equivalent of a hype man? Like, is there someone that was kind of boosting you up all the way, or like?
Well, I think my editors. I worked with 3 different editors, just through circumstance. My original editor left Penguin. His name was Michael Nolan, and he works at the Saturday paper now, and he's a really, really amazing guy, just such an astute, sharp editor, and he was my early champion at Penguin with this manuscript, because I only had, well, originally I just had 1 chapter that I'd written in a month that I sent off, and people picked up on that, and he was my early hype man, Michael Nolan. Yeah, I loved working with him. But I think he'd been there for a long time, and so he wanted something new, so he went to the Saturday paper, and I obviously couldn't begrudge him that.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you sent that chapter in, was that like how much time was that before it actually came out? Was that the 2 years?
A couple of years. So what happened was quite funny, really. I had always thought writing a novel would be a huge accomplishment, and I was always impressed by people that I met along the way who had written novels, but I didn't know how to do it myself. I'd made albums before. I wrote raps and poems very quickly, and I kind of thought I didn't think I had the persistence or the dedication to finish a novel, and I just didn't know how to do it. I hadn't written prose, besides a couple of short things at high school and uni. And so I'd finished a hip-hop album with this group I was in called Money Cat, and I was living in Melbourne at the time. and I was being interviewed on Triple R by Sophie Cunningham and Alicia Sometimes. And I'd known both of them before that for a little while, more through doing spoken word at writers' festivals. And I knew that Sophie had been in the publishing world. And I was sort of just trying to impress them. And they were saying, oh, yeah, so what are you working on now that you finished this album? And now that's come out. And I was like, well, I'm sort of working on this Dorothy Porter meets Urban Welsh verse novel about a masturbating arsonist. And I'd only written literally, I think, 3 pages of this thing, just sketched out a few ideas in verse. And it was the scene, the first chapter at the Greyhound races when all the guys are doing cocaine. And I said this to them, and off air, Sophie goes to me, wow, that thing that you're working on sounds really interesting. You know, when can I read something? And just, you know, bullshitting my way through, I was kind of like, oh, look, it hasn't really been banged into shape. Just give me a little bit of time and I'll get you something. And so I went off for a month, just got on my laptop and then finished this chapter. And that chapter is pretty much unchanged. The thing that you read now is unchanged from when I first wrote it, pretty much. And so I sent that to Sophie, and she immediately said, look, we need to have a meeting about this. And so I met her, and she said, I don't know, publishing is kind of screwed at the moment, but I think a lot of people would be interested in this. I don't think anything like it has been written before. Maybe you should work on a few more chapters and then send it out there to some publishers. I know a few people. But then I was at a house party with my friend Emily Zoe Baker, and she's with Michael Nolan. And he asked me about this thing, and he said, oh, you're working on a novel. You realise I'm a senior editor at Penguin. And I had never known that. I thought he was a musician, actually. And so I sent him the manuscript, and then the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, that is a fantastic story. I mean, just I guess the serendipity, in a way, of being somewhere and telling someone what you're thinking about doing, and then that's kind of like the motivation to get it done. I also read somewhere that you the same kind of chance meeting, you ran into Urban Welsh, and that's how you get his name on the front of your book as a mate. I mean, how much of do you think of writing is getting yourself out there and meeting people? And
well, there are huge doses of luck involved, I think. But yeah, you've got to get out there in the world and meet people and engage with people. You never know what's going to happen. I mean, firstly, I just have to say that I do recognise how lucky and privileged I am to have had this dream run. I always feel a little bit guilty because I know how many writers are out there doing the hard slog and have been trying to get their work published and have written 12 manuscripts and this and that with very little luck. But I feel, and I am relatively young as well to be a novelist. But I have been out there in the world creating work and putting it out there and being rejected in the industry, in the arts industry, and doing shows to 5 people and all of that. So it's not as if I kind of just had this immediate success. I think it's happened over a long period of time, and it's been quite cumulative.
Definitely. I mean, you kind of touched before on writing when you're starting out at school. I mean, I'm a school teacher, so you could probably see I've probably got marking behind me. I actually used one of your poems the other day in class. It was the one you used at TEDx. I was thinking about using the Rantham, but I thought maybe not a great one for a Year 8 English class.
Right. Yeah. Intense. A lot of swearing.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, have you had other people say that they've used your work in classes in schools?
Yeah, it's been used a lot actually, and I think around the world. I mean, I definitely know that a lot of kind of international schools use it, and a lot of high school teachers from the States and Canada have used. I think there's a couple. There's one called Play On. That's the first poetry video that I made. It's this black and white one, really simple. But a lot of schools use that. And even universities as well. I got contacted by a lady at UCLA, and she used one of my spoken word poems to teach her literature of migration class. And that's so gratifying. I mean, that is just amazing to me because I was trying to set a bit of a standard for young people and ethnic writers and show that poetry can be something accessible and it can speak to the here and now. And I decided to do that using social media and using YouTube and all these things, and treat my poems as if they were songs that a band might promote or something like that. So I was doing it from the early days with with MySpace and Facebook and all of that stuff. But it's hugely gratifying and pleasing to reach out to young people and to connect with them. And I work with a lot of young people as well. I go to a lot of high schools and youth centres, and it feels as if it's this almost revolutionary time for poetry in this country. I mean, I know that the popularity of poetry is always cyclical, but right now so many kids are getting into it of all different backgrounds and both girls and boys, and it's really amazing to see people feel so empowered by using words, and it was something so positive, you know, taking negative feelings and frustration and depression and anger and turning it into words through the alchemy of poetry. It's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I totally see that every time. I mean, that was the reaction I saw students make to your work in class. And I mean, did you see the thing that happened? I think NPR did it 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, through High Tech High in the United States, where Kendrick Lamar went and visited.
Oh yeah, that would have been amazing.
That was phenomenal. I mean, just to see the kids reacting to him and then getting up and learning this, I guess, the skills of a cipher and telling their own stories. I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, have you ever had, like, when you go to a school or when you're working with young people, does that come naturally, or is that something that they have to be taught? Or?
I think it comes very naturally. I would say that poetry and storytelling, I always say this, but I think that poetry and storytelling are as essential to human experience as breath or blood. You know, it's the way we connect with each other, it's the way we conceive of our lives, it's the way we dream, and I think it's always a bit ridiculous when people say, oh, poetry is dead. I mean, it might die in terms of publishing or sales or something, but I think that everybody appreciates poetry, and it's perhaps one of the highest of the art forms. I think it's the highest and the purest of the literary art forms. And even if you think about it, the way people will say, oh, this athlete is you know, he runs like poetry in motion or something. I think even subconsciously people realize what a pure and incandescent thing poetry is. So yeah, I think a lot of it comes really naturally to the kids, and sometimes they don't even realize that they're writing poetry. Even if they're writing down some of their conversations that they've had on the bus or something, and then it comes out as poetry. Yeah,
that's how I opened the unit. I just played your TED talk, and I didn't say the word poetry because I think there's something, you know, psychological for the students. They've got, you know, if you say the word poetry, they feel like they're going to be putting themselves out there, and that can be, you know, quite a scary thing sometimes.
And that's why hip hop has been so great in getting young people to express themselves, because it's cool. You know, there isn't that block that it's dusty and pretentious or something like that. So I think you kind of have to find these different access points to poetry. And yeah, songwriting in general, I think comedy, storytelling and hip-hop are good access points. And sometimes people get me wrong, you know, they think that I'm saying that we should do away with the canon or not teach kids, you know, T.S. Eliot or whatever. Oh, well, Shakespeare's always the main example. And I'm not saying that. I just think that it has got to the point where, for whatever reason, kids do think it's so pretentious, and there just need to be these avenues and access points. And spoken word is a really good one. And I'm not sure why so many ethnic kids get into it. I've got my own theories that maybe it taps into oral traditions that their cultures already have. I'm not sure what it is.
There's an interesting part in the book. I think it's Solomon is talking about the representation in Australian hip hop of, you know, different cultures, and he says that it's mostly you know, made by white dudes. I mean, do you have an opinion about? I mean, it's particularly commercially successful hip hop in Australia. Do you have an opinion about that, or why that might be?
It's changing. I mean, yeah, a few years ago, I thought it was a little bit worrying that it was so dominated by white men and quite middle-class men oftentimes too, it seemed. I don't know everyone's stories. And I think it's now coming around that there's a lot of, that there are young people of various backgrounds getting into the hip-hop world and then having that kind of commercial success and Triple J success. People like Remy, people like Briggs, TK Mazda, and I think it's really great because I think hip-hop was always good at expressing the collective dreams and aspirations and struggles of minorities, you know? And so it was kind of weird in Australia that it was actually people representing the majority that were telling the stories. And I don't think it was like that at the beginning. From what people told me about the early hip-hop scene in Australia, MCs, b-boys and graph artists, it was very diverse. But for some reason, it became really white. And that is really changing, I think.
Mm. Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. I mean, especially those examples you've just given me. I mean, I kind of want to go back to the thing we touched on before about school and you know, stuffy, you know, the pretentious poetry's being scaring kids off. I mean, did you have that experience at school? Like, how did you find?
I was really lucky. I think because my father is a poet and I came from an artistic family, so I never had that thought. I never had that belief that poetry was really boring or pretentious. The way my father spoke of it with such passion and the way my mother spoke of it, I never thought about it that way. And then in class, I had a really good English teacher in year 5 called Ms. Leanne Patterson, and she set these kind of writing tasks to write poems, and I think we had to write, I don't know, like 3 tankas, you know, the kind of a longer form of a haiku. And everyone was just grumbling and moaning about it. All the other kids were going, oh, this is so boring. And I just put the pen to the page, and I realized that I'd written 6 of them, and that I just really loved it. And I think I was writing about maybe Egyptian gods or mythology or something like that I was into back then. And I always enjoyed it. And I couldn't understand why it was that no one else really enjoyed it. So that's why I was always searching for a form of poetry that was really accessible and really hit people and was for young people about things I could relate to. And so, yeah, I mean, I could see that. It also depends on the teacher. I get the feeling you're a really good teacher, but I think there are shitty ones out there who are strangely conservative. I would never have thought that English teachers or people teaching the creative arts could be conservative in that way and adhere so strictly to the canon or the idea of high literature or something like that. And so I had a teacher that I always had run-ins with in high school who said that Irvin Welsh, because I was reading Trainspotting at the time in year 8, I think it was, and she was saying it was far too profane, it wasn't real literature. And I just remember being very confounded by that. And now life's come full circle because, yeah, I met Irvin. We became friends in Jaipur in India, actually, bizarre. And then he gave me a quote for my book, and that was what I actually wrote him a letter when I handed him the manuscript. And I just said, you know, I feel like life has come full circle because I was so inspired by Trainspotting, the idea that you could find stories in unlikely places, that you could write literature that used colloquial language. You know, it didn't have to be this lofty academic language or anything like that. You could use street slang, and that influenced me a lot. And so I said that to him, and I said, now, you know, 17 years on, I've written my own book, and I'd like to give it to you to have a read. And it was, people ask you sometimes about these, like, when was the moment you realized you'd made it or something? I mean, I don't really even believe in that, in kind of making it, but if there was one, I think that would be it.
Yeah.
Maybe even more than having the book itself published.
Have you had any experiences with people coming up to you after having read the book and saying something similar to you that you said to Irvin?
Yeah, well, I think the book hasn't been out there long enough. I definitely know that there are people, particularly people with a minority background, who have come up and said, wow, it feels like this book was really speaking to me and I've never read these type of characters written about. But I think more with the poetry, because my poetry's been out there for a longer period of time and I've been gigging and everything. You know, I did notice, and of course I can't lionize myself and say that I've had such a massive impact, but I've just seen that a lot more young Muslim and Middle Eastern kids started writing poetry after I won the Australian Poetry Slam, because I think there is a huge visceral power to seeing somebody like you, whatever that means, getting up on the stage and I remember when I started doing spoken word, there really weren't that many ethnic people or brown people doing it. So I think that has had an impact.
Yeah, totally. Actually, that fits really nicely into a question we got. I mean, have you got any really great suggestions for us to search up on YouTube and have a look at to see if there's any, you know, any great voices that you've heard?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So many. Okay. Well, number one on my list in terms of Australian spoken word would be Alia Gabrez. So it's spelled Aliagabrez, and she's a young Eritrean Australian woman who writes amazing stuff about her heritage and just really powerful, graceful poetry. So there's a really great video up online of that. And then, of course, my bro Luca Lesson, who's a Greek-Australian guy, and he's just one of our finest exponents of spoken word poetry, really world-class. Abe Nook, have you heard of him?
No.
Okay, so he is a young guy from Melbourne. He's a Sudanese-Australian guy, and I think he came runner-up in the Australian Poetry Slam a couple of years ago. And he didn't speak English 8 years ago, I think it is, 8 or 9 years ago, and now he's touring as a poet with these incredibly hard-hitting poems, and he kind of talks a lot about his experiences of being a refugee and being in the refugee camp and how he could have been a child soldier and everything like that. And I just think it's really amazing that these voices are getting out there now, and that the tone, the texture, and even the complexion of Australian poetry is changing, because that was part of the thing when I was growing up. It all just seemed so white, and not just that, middle class and middle aged. And so to see that, and that's why I think I originally went towards hip hop, because even though I'm not African American, I'm not from the ghetto by any means, seeing guys like Ice Cube and Tupac telling their stories in such a raw way, I felt like I could relate to that in some way, you know, because I was experiencing racism. I was experiencing some sort of dislocation in Australia.
Speaking of Australia, you're currently in Malaysia, right? I saw on Twitter that you're in Penang.
Yeah, I'm in Penang, where my parents met, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. I went to Penang maybe 6 years ago, and I ate, you know, my body weight in laksa.
Oh yeah, I just had a really good one today. There's the famous Penang Road laksa. It even calls itself famous, but I think now through self-actualization it has become famous. And yeah, it's a really good asam laksa, and then you can order the good chendol at the same place as well, which is awesome.
So whereabouts is it? Just in the name? It's on Penang Road?
Yeah, it's on the corner of Penang Road and another road I don't know, but it's really hot here at the moment. I mean, I think Penang, it might be the hottest part of Malaysia, but you see these enormous lines of people waiting to get this particular chendol, this Malaysian sweet made with pandan and coconut milk and palm sugar and crushed ice in it. And so there are these enormous lines, but I always go inside, order the laksa first, and then get the chendol to cool me down afterwards.
Well, you are totally in a different part of the world to me. I'm sitting under the heater in Sydney, where there's an Antarctic blast, apparently.
Oh, man, I've heard. Yeah, because my mum is living in Queanbeyan, so she sends me all these kind of photos of the cats shivering together and stuff.
So, speaking of Malaysia, what are you doing there at the moment? Are you working on anything? Or?
Yeah, I'm working on a whole lot of stuff, actually. I got one of these AsiaLink residencies, which is really, really great. Again, a massive privilege, and I just feel like a luxury to have 3 months away. So they give you 3 months and give you a place to stay and just let you run riot, really, and just write whatever the hell you want. So I've been working on new songs, new hip-hop songs with Joelistics from Melbourne and Poncho from Fundamentals. I've been writing poems, I've been writing short stories, and I've been kind of, I guess, interviewing in a rather informal way a lot of people here and starting to work on the next novel. So I've sketched out a few ideas for that.
Oh wow! I was going to ask you about if you got plans for another book, whether you're going to go back to focusing on spoken word. But it sounds like you're doing all of the things at once.
Yeah, I like to work that way. You know, I think I'd go a bit crazy if I was just writing poetry or just writing songs. I like to kind of move in between them because I do see them as different branches of the same river. And so I enjoy just dabbling in all of them at the same time. And it's kind of one of those things, I read this really good quote by Roberto Bolaño, and they were asking him for, and he's one of my favorite writers, and they were asking him for some advice on writing short stories, and he says, oh, well, you should always write 3 or 4 at the same time. And if you can't write 3 or 4 at the same time, you should write 5 or 6. If you can't write 5 or 6 at the same time, you should write 6 or 7. And I kind of like that because you can kind of just peck away at these stories and poems all at the same time, and then you suddenly realize when you look on your laptop, oh, that poem is really close to being finished, or that story is, and it doesn't have the same kind of pressure maybe that I felt when I was having to just focus completely on the book.
Mm. So with the book that you're writing, are you going to be picking up stories? You said you're picking up stories from Malaysia. Is it going to be non-fiction, or is it going to be...
No, it's very much going to be fiction. It's about this... I've spoken about it a little bit before, and I'm still just formulating the ideas and the plan. But it's about 2 characters, a Malaysian-Australian woman called Rosanna Aslan, who's an aspiring graphic novelist, and a man she meets, let me say, a person she meets, who's a blind Malay transgender sea captain. And they go on a journey together from Darwin into the Indonesian and Malaysian archipelago, and each place that they land is a different moment in time or history. So it's transgender, transnational, time traveling, completely bizarre and unruly. But I'm collecting all these really interesting stories. I mean, I've got some books here that this is random books I've got. I've got this one about pirates in the Sulu Sea. I've got this one on human and tiger interactions in Indonesia and Malaysia from 1600 to 1950. Just completely bizarre stories, and so I'm just soaking a lot of it in, and then I have no idea how it's going to come out in the book. Whether I'm going to use verse again, I'm not sure. I've just sketched out some ideas, but I felt like with Here Come the Dogs, I really dealt with the Australia that I know. And now I want to turn my face towards the archipelago because it plays such a huge part in my personal history. But also, I am very Australian, and I feel like Australians just don't know much about Indonesia and Malaysia at all and aren't really interested. And I even heard someone say, a lady who'd written a great book on Indonesia, I said, is it coming out in Australia? She said, I can't really find a publisher because Australians just don't give a shit about Indonesia. And I thought, wow, that's really sad. It's a bit of an indictment on our society, I think, because that's our closest neighbour. And I thought, okay, if anyone in Australian literature could write a book about the archipelago and get Australians to listen to it or to read it, maybe that could be me. I think I'm in a particular position to do that, or to explore it at least in an interesting way. And that's what I felt about Here Come the Dogs as well. I didn't feel as if there were that many people who could write that particular book.
Yeah. And you say interesting in an interesting way. I mean, it sounds fascinating. I mean, have you seen much of, have you been to a lot of the places that you're going to write about? Or are you doing it mostly through research?
I have.
And interviewing?
I want to write about Makassar, Sulawesi. Famously had a lot of contact with the Yolngu in Arnhem Land, well before Europeans came to Australia. And I'm fascinated by that because it was kind of central to the spice trade, and really kind of a global centre as well. We don't conceive of it in that way, but even in 1600, you know, all this contact between India, China, the archipelago, even South America, you know, silver coming from South America through the Philippines, and in Borneo, there are these ancient glass beads that I write about in Here Come the Dogs, that maybe originally were from Venice, you know, thousands of years old. And it's so, this whole idea of globalization that we always talk about as being so modern, really it's been happening for a long time. And Southeast Asia was such a hub. So I want to write about that, and I'm interviewing some quite interesting people. You know, I'm interested in gender and sexuality. I wrote a lot about a certain type of aggrieved Aussie masculinity in Here Come the Dogs. But I'm quite interested in in transgender issues, and so I've been talking to some trans people over here, trying to get my head around what it's like. And that's not just me as a fiction writer interested in that. That's me as a human and as a man and as a citizen. And it seems like, you know, that is really a frontier of a lot of discrimination. I mean, that's probably obvious in any country in the world, but particularly here because you could get arrested for it, you know. So I'm interested in that, and I'm talking to people a lot about that. But I haven't really sketched too much down. I'm just soaking it all in.
How do you think
you need to have the time to do that, you know? It's like with an album, when, you know, the first album is always the great one because it's been, you know, 25 years in the making, and then the sophomore one has only had a year. So I'm just trying to calm myself down and just give myself the space and time to soak these things in.
Well, you know, it must be wonderful to have that space, you know, with the Asia Link. Is it a grant or is it a scheme?
It's a grant/residency. So I think I'm here at the Hotel Panaga. You can see this lovely, luxurious room that I've got. And so they often have visual artists come here, give them, you know, 2 months, 3 months to create new work, and then they give you kind of a stipend so you can pay for your materials and things like that. No, it's such a luxury. It's been really, really great. And Penang's a pretty fascinating place. It's just got such a rich cultural history. And then the food doesn't hurt either.
Oh, no, not at all. How do you feel like, I mean, I know you're just getting your ideas and thinking about how it's going to form. I mean, how do you think the book will go in Southeast Asia? Do you think it will be...
I mean, I think it will probably get banned. There's a lot you can't really talk about, particularly stuff to do with sexuality, actually. But I also think it will be quite interesting to see people's reaction, because there are these questions of legitimacy, you know, that happen everywhere. Like in Australia, growing up, people are always asking you, oh, where are you from? And then you even see some dickhead like Dawn Fraser recently saying that. But having said that, I think her view about the illegitimacy of a certain type of migrant to Australia and people not being proper Australians, I think a lot of people feel the same way. Anyway, so growing up, kind of battling against that, and then coming here where people see me as just very Western, very Australian, which I probably am, these same questions of legitimacy come up again. So I remember a few years ago when I was at a writers' festival in Sri Lanka, they had a spotlight on Malaysian writing, and they had included me in that spotlight. And I remember the other Malaysian writers, they were sort of getting their backs up a little bit because I was saying, oh, you're not really Malaysian, like this and that. And so you're kind of always trapped a little bit in this liminal space. But I think that liminal space is something that I'm really interested in writing about, as you would have seen with Here Come the Dogs, a character like Solomon. Well, all of them, really. They're all trapped in between worlds. Jimmy doesn't really know what his world is, but then Alex is sort of in between Australia and Macedonia. And yeah, I thought that was quite an interesting topic to mine, or area, or space.
Yeah, it most definitely was. I mean, I think that's probably a good place to now start talking about the book. I mean, we had a meeting yesterday. I don't know if you actually found this out, but we met in Sydney at the Palace Verona Cinema, and we were sitting there talking, and then this guy just says, "Do you mind if I take a photo?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" The guy that was working at the Palace Verona is a mate of yours.
Oh, right. Who is it?
I forgot to get his name. I'm really, you know, it was a really absent-minded. So you expect some photos of people reading that book in Sydney.
Oh, that's cool.
But there were a few questions that people had for you, I guess, you know, directly about the book. And I mean, the first one's already been answered, really. The first one was like, "What's next for you, Omar? I mean, what are you going? What you focusing on?" And I mean, you've kind of already answered that one.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of fiction, actually maybe even before the novel, I would like to put out a book of short stories. I really love writing short stories. I'm quite new to it, but I've had quite a good hit rate over the last year. I've had a couple published, and a couple more are going to come out this year. And I think that it's a really beautiful art form, and it's quite brave, and it's daring, and you have to create a world that people can invest in and buy into with a really short number of words. But it's not poetry, you know. It's kind of, yeah, it's interesting, and I'm enjoying writing a lot of those. But I don't know if my publisher, you know, publishers don't really like to publish books of poetry, books of short stories. They say they don't sell. But that's what I'd like to do. And then next year I want to put an album out as well.
Well, forgive, I might be wrong here, but I think Maxine Beneba Clark also did the Asia Link thing last year. Is that right? She did that one before yourself?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, actually. I know she did a residency that I did through RMIT, and she went to Penang, and I did mine in Hoi An and in Hanoi with Kate Kennedy, which was really great. Well, both of them really great short story writers. But what was the question? Oh yeah, what's next? Yeah, well that's already a pretty jam-packed schedule. Trying to put an album out and a book of short stories, and then maybe a novel. And I'm working on a one-man play. That's another.
Oh yeah, I did read that, and I was curious as to what that's like. Because I mean, you've talked about, I mean, working with a band, you're obviously collaborating. What's the level of collaboration across these different things? Like, do you work with other people?
Well, the hip-hop stuff is the most collaborative, but then I really like to build up a good network of readers around myself for my fiction, for my short stories. So I've got a lot of great people giving me feedback. I think with the novel, I was a little bit too precious about it. If I could do one thing differently, it would be I'd be less precious and I would bounce it off a few more people. I think I still had that attitude, which is a little bit sort of juvenile in a way, that I should just keep it all to myself and make it perfect before I show anyone. But of course, it's never going to be perfect. So the play has been kind of looming over me for a few years, and I've abandoned 2 different plays in that time. I'd kind of written the skeletons of 2 of them, and they just didn't quite work. One of them was going to be this sort of fairy tale about a single mum and her daughter. That didn't work, and then I started working on one called Bone Gatherer that a lot of people were asking me about. That was kind of about the Aboriginal history of Canberra and Queanbeyan, and I just, well, firstly I found it hard to write in that style, to write a play. I've never written a play before, and I think it's a bit more hands-on. You can't really feel your way through it in the same way you can with fiction, because theatre is all about action. It exists on the stage, you know. So I think you have to have worked a little bit more with actors to do that. And also, I was writing about the Aboriginal history of Canberra, and I felt that it maybe wasn't my story to tell, that one. And speaking with a lot of local mob who were very much behind me, I just got this feeling that it's the type of thing where you would have to spend 10 or 15 years researching it, in a way, and then you'd be able to write about it, not just, you know, a couple of weeks or something, or a couple of months.
You mentioned before that you work with a lot of youth groups. I mean, is there potential there in Queanbeyan to work with the local Indigenous kids?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, the problem is that I'm not in Queanbeyan very much. I'm sort of travelling and touring all the time. Right. I would love to do that. I went to the Queanbeyan Library. I've spent a lot of time at the Queanbeyan Library. I wrote a lot of scraps of Here Come the Draft there, and Here Come the Draft, Here Come the Dogs, in draft form in Queanbeyan Library and in Queanbeyan McDonald's, actually. I probably shouldn't say that because people get on me about it. But for some reason, there's a certain zen quality to the outside area of Queanbeyan McDonald's.
Powered by nuggets.
Yeah. Well, no, it's just the hash browns that I'm there for. I don't eat the meat there. That feels bad. I mean, I'm sure, you know, the potatoes are completely unethical in some way or another as well. But yeah, I went to Queanbeyan Library and I talked to the librarians there about maybe doing a bit of work with local high school students, but I haven't been back to Queanbeyan since I spoke to them, so yeah, probably in the future.
You need more time.
Yeah, I do.
There's a couple more questions. One of them was we looked at a couple of reviews of the book, obviously after we'd read it, and you know, to see what other people were saying about it. And Robin, who comes along to our book club, she was asking, how do you deal with criticism? So when people are talking about your work, critically?
I try to be quite philosophical about it because it's part of the arena of ideas is good criticism. You have to have criticism, and you have to be willing to cop it if you're going to put your work out there in the public. You know, especially if you're making art that is not fence-sitter art, you know that it's going to be controversial, you know it's going to be a little bit transgressive in some way. You cannot expect people to all like it. Also, my mother was a theatre reviewer for many years, so I understand what criticism is about, and not to take it too harshly or personally.
Was your mum a harsh critic?
Yeah, and I respected that, you know, because sometimes she would find it difficult. She ran this arts magazine, and then she was the editor of the Canberra Times, and sometimes she found it really frustrating that critics would be too nice about something, or they would only review things that they liked. And I think that's a little bit unethical as a reviewer. You owe it to the public, and you owe it to the arts practitioner to say what you really think, and to be harsh if needs be. Not to be a hater. You know, that's the only time when it annoys me, is when it feels sort of personal in some way, or it's not really about the work, or someone was willfully misunderstanding what you were saying. But I heard Robin Archer say something really interesting about this, which is that she tries not to develop a thick skin, because, you know, they're always saying, oh, you should have a thick skin, and I think sometimes that's really important, because it's how you protect yourself and defend yourself. But she says that an artist should have a thin skin so they can get a lot of the input of the world, and so she tries to keep that thin skin in a way so that it keeps her on point as an artist. And I sort of, yeah, I can understand that. I think that was quite an interesting view to take.
Yeah, did she write that somewhere, or?
I think she might have said it at a talk I went to. I've heard her speak many times, so I can't even remember where it was. Actually, the most recent was she gave this great talk in London. I was at King's College at this Australia-New Zealand Literature Festival. But then bloody Alexander Downer, the High Commissioner, got up there and just gave the most pompous, kind of disrespectful speech. I mean, there were heaps of black fellas there. Not heaps, but there were quite a few. And he's going on about, oh, you know, the British were so great for Australia and how awesome they were. And then he says, I mean, admittedly, a few mistakes were made. He kind of says like this. And I mean, I was booing him. I started booing him. I made a huge eruption and sort of disgraced myself. But I just couldn't believe it, yeah.
The question I asked you before about your mum being a tough critic, I was wondering if she was a tough critic of your work.
Oh, yeah, I think she always was. There was a lot of tough love there, but I liked that, and I don't know whether that's just because I inherited some of those attitudes from her. But the way I see it, say with my editors, I tell them to be very, very critical, because I don't need to be handled with, you know, silk gloves or whatever. I'm not a child. I want my work to be really, really good, and that means I want people to be real with me. But then at the same time, you have to follow your own instincts and your own vision. You know, for example, I'll give you two examples. I've got this poem called My Generation that I performed on Q&A, and it's probably one of my signature poems. My mum thought it was rubbish when I performed it to her, and she was kind of like, oh, I don't think that's really one of your best ones, and I don't know about that. But then I just deep down within myself, I said, no, I think this one is special. There's something about this one. And so I kept performing it, and then that's one of my better known pieces. And I think it's one that sort of captures an era of Australian society. And so I'm glad I didn't listen to it. And then with Here Come the Dogs, all three of my editors didn't like the dreams. They hated the dream sequences, and they thought, oh, people will find it pretentious, and they didn't really get it. But deep within myself, I knew that this was something I had to do for the story, to take it into a more mythical realm and to say something that maybe I don't even understand about the inner lives of these characters. And so I'm really glad that I kept them in there, and that I left this book kind of drenched in story, in dreams, drenched in dreams. And I'm glad I did that, that I followed my inner vision. But then, of course, there were other times when what they said was exactly right, that it was too flabby in this section, or all the action needs to be brought forward, or something like that. And they were totally right. So some of it's a matter of intuition.
Another question kind of ties into this one. It's about understanding, and it was interesting because we're talking very, very different cultural backgrounds and age groups within our book club, and we were talking about the hip hop references, and I understood half of them, but
Right.
But I reckon the majority of people that were at book club didn't necessarily understand anyone beyond, say, like the Hilltop Hoods or or Tupac. Another question that someone wanted to ask was, what's the purpose of the references, like the hip hop references? Is it to one reviewer said it's to create a barrier, but like a subculture kind of thing, or is it essential to the story? Because when I was listening to it, I was thinking, I just want to put this record on to hear what this song sounds like, so that like a soundtrack almost. I mean, what was the purpose of all of it?
Served that purpose, to be a soundtrack. Yeah, that's exactly right. There's one particular scene where this song by Taunts, who's quite an underground, hardcore Melbourne rapper, his song's called Poison, and it's extremely aggressive and dark. And if you put that on and you read the chapter, that's when Jimmy's just getting really drunk by himself and kind of wandering around, and you would really get a feel for the scene. It wasn't meant to be a barrier. I was trying to entice people into this world and show that it has value, and to show that it's not just some frivolous thing that these guys are doing. It's a whole culture that they're deeply, deeply invested in, and that they find a lot of redemption and liberation and empowerment through. And I don't know, I always think it's a bit weird when people question me so intensely about that, about all the hip-hop references, because say if you're reading Moby Dick, will you really be saying, oh, there are so many whale references, or and even a lot of books that I read that are written by kind of older people or more middle class people make a lot of references to, say, classical music or painting, different painters or something like that. And that's part of the texture of the story. I mean, the challenge for me was trying to do it in a way that wasn't too alienating. So maybe I succeeded, maybe I didn't. Maybe some people did feel alienated. But I tried to put things in there that the context would become obvious through the way I wrote it. And that was just adding some texture to it. I mean, I had a German reader recently who said that he really enjoyed that, even though he had heard of none of the rappers that I mentioned, because he could understand that each thing I said about the character, or the artist that the character liked, said something about their personality, because Solomon likes the kind of smoother stuff with synths and everything like that, and then Jimmy, he wants to be a bit more hardcore, so he likes the really hardcore raps and everything. But yeah, and I also hoped that people might delve into the world a bit more and say, oh wow, I've never heard of this artist, I might go and find something out about them.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, last time I saw a copy of Moby Dick, it had like a bunch of pictures of all the different kind of whaling implements and whatever. Yeah. I was just thinking, like, if there's any need for like a hip hop glossary, it just kind of seems a little bit redundant,
Yeah, I mean, that's it. Like, my US publisher put out the idea that maybe we should have a glossary, and I said, no, this is fiction. It's not anthropology. And if someone doesn't understand it, I think the story still hangs together. And sometimes, when you're reading a book, there's, say, a word you don't understand. And if you really want to find out about it, then look it up. You've got a dictionary, you've got Wikipedia, you've got Google,
So that's an interesting one. So do you think that, you've said about it, one of your German readers loved it. Do you think, because your book's coming out in America next year, early next year, do you think?
Yeah, early next year.
You're talking a lot of references to largely an American subculture and American music style. Like, how do you think that'll translate?
I think people will be quite confounded by it. Like, I really have no idea what Americans are going to think of the book. My publisher is really optimistic, but I just don't know, because Americans can be so parochial, especially about sort of things that they think they've invented, you know.
Right.
And so it'll just be a bit strange to them because the book is so hip hop, but then it's so Australian. So those frames of reference won't really be there for them, or the artists. And I'm intrigued to see. I'm intrigued to see what they think. I think some people will find that really cool. Other people might be a bit alienated by it.
I'm glad it's going to stay the same. I don't know if you remember when the film The Castle got released into the United States, they changed a lot of the cultural references. So like,
no way.
You know, like a Kingswood and a Tirana became like a Dodge and a, you know, whatever.
I don't know what, I heard a really good story about that, about when Tomorrow When the War Began came out in America. They changed it to When the War Began because they said it was grammatically incorrect. I was just like, oh, come on, that's the coolest thing about the book.
Yeah, yeah. But you know, I thank you so much for having a chat to us, Omar. I mean, it's been wonderful to have a chat to you, just you know, one-to-one, but also to have the questions that book club.
No worries. Have we run out of time? Have we?
Yeah. Well, I'm at school, and the alarm goes on at 8 o'clock, so I'll be in serious trouble if the alarm goes off. But I did have one last question, that, you know, from my own kind of questions at the book club. I was curious, like I listened to a lot of audiobooks, and I was thinking that this would be almost, it just seems to fit, you know, the verse novel as an audiobook, but there isn't one, is there?
No, I'd like to do one. They take a long time to record, but Penguin does have a recording studio, so I'd like to do that. It's just, the problem for me is that, yes, I am a spoken word performer. Well, there are two things. Firstly, I'm not an actor, and a lot of the characters have particular ethnicities, and I wouldn't want to be seen to be stereotyping people. You know, say a Macedonian accent or a quote-unquote Waggy accent, you know, and then it's me trying to do it, and people would say, oh, is that what Omar thinks it sounds like, you know? And then the second thing is that there is a certain magic to fiction, which is that when you read it on the page, you create the world in your head. And sometimes I feel that my voice would be too particular or too forceful in putting certain images and flow and rhythm into people's heads. But at the same time, a lot of people say that they would really love to hear me do it. So maybe in the near future, I'm not sure.
Thank you so much, Omar, for having a chat to us today, and best of luck with the rest of the residency. How much longer have you got?
I have another 2 weeks here, and then I'm going to KL to Kuala Lumpur for about 2.5 weeks, and then I'm coming back for Melbourne Writers Festival. So yeah, still a little bit of time. You
got plenty of time to have some more Luxor.
Oh yeah, one a day. A Luxor a day keeps the haters away.
Thanks, Omar.
All right, see ya.
See ya.